Hello, folks, and welcome back to Chris Wyatt Reports on the Audu Africa channel. This is Chris live in central Pennsylvania. My guest today is known to many folks in South Africa and around the world. Of course, that's advocate for the Constitutional Court, Mark Oppenheimer, who now also holds a couple other positions since we last spoke to Mark a few months back. One of them, I believe, is president of the Institute of Race Relations. Mark, how's it going?
Yeah, excellent. It was 2 elections in 2 weeks. So I was elected to become the new president of the Institute of Race Relations, an organization that's been going since 1929. And the second election was to become a member of UCT's council, which is basically the board of the university. So there's 30 members of council, and council plays a role in determining what the university's vision will be.
Okay, well, I'm ready to participate. Fees must fall. Yikes. Well, for distinction, so that the audience understands, you're president of the Institute of Race Relations. There is a chief executive officer who does the operations. It's a different role, is it not?
Yes, it is a different role, and compatible with my life as an advocate. So I will be continuing to fight the good fight in South Africa's courts.
Right, so you're still engaged as an advocate. This is, I don't want to say, it's the wrong phrase, but it is the vernacular amongst the millennials. It's a side hustle, so to speak, but not really. But the point is, it's akin to being a member of a corporate board or something like that, from a standpoint that it doesn't occupy all your time.
Yes, exactly. So the idea is that the president of the IRR can help shape its vision as well, and draw on the resources of its council members. So there's about 30 members of the IRR's council as well, some very illustrious people involved in all sorts of sectors of civil society. And it's partly a way of ensuring that the IRR stays true to the values that it's always cared about. So there's a concern that, over time, organizations can be hijacked, that they can shift their focus and no longer live up to their original ideals. We've definitely found that in some organizations in South Africa, and you definitely find it in the States. So if you think about an organization like the American Civil Liberties Union, which really cared about free speech and was willing to stand up for some quite offensive kinds of speech over the years, that they would stake their reputation on that. That seems to be an organization that has abandoned that value, so much so that it has been sued by one of its former lawyers for wrongful dismissal, and they've claimed that the speech she used was the reason why she should have been fired. She said things like, I'm afraid of the people that I work for, and they have adopted a policy which is to keep flogging us until the morale improves. This was viewed as indirectly racist, and so she was fired. She, by the way, is an Asian woman who was a victim of domestic violence. So, someone who's sort of subject to all sorts of, oppressive narratives, and was pushed out of the organization. So the idea is that the IRR mustn't lose its fundamental values. It's an organization that cares about freedom. It's a classical liberal organization, as I say. Dates back to 1929, one of the organizations that helped dismantle apartheid, cares deeply about non-racialism. So many of the values that are close to my own heart.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. For almost my entire adult life, we've considered the ACLU to be the American Criminal Liberties Union, because they seem to only stand up for convicted felons rather than for people's civil liberties. That's long been the case. Along with the Southern Poverty Law Center, both obviously far left activist organizations who betray what they claim their stated goal is. So yeah, no, it's good that it's kind of like an ombudsman, a role to make sure that an organization stays on focus and where it's supposed to be and deal with these issues and have that authority. Well, before we go any further, first, let me just say congratulations. What an honor it is to be associated with you. I don't know if I'm associated with you, but to know you, I mean, I think I can call you a friend if I can't just call me out. But it's quite an honor to be elected president of such a prestigious organization with such a long and storied history. It's truly awesome, and I'm really happy for you. And I'm also happy for the IRR. I think that this is a great development for them as well. So again, congratulations.
Thank you. It's an organization with a lot of influence. So you mentioned that there's the president and the CEO. So our current CEO is John Endres. And John was quoted at length by Thabo Mbeki in the 30th anniversary of South Africa's democracy. So that gives you a sense that the IRR really can influence people of all different sides of the spectrum. Part of what John had to say was that South Africa's got two stories, that for the first 15 years of its development, moving out of apartheid, a lot of good was done, and that a lot of reversal has happened over the last 15 years. So something that I think Mbeki would agree with, given that he was at the helm in the first part. Although I think Mbeki bears some responsibility for many of the seeds that were sown that later led to some of South Africa's woes.
Well, I'd have to agree with you 100% there. I think that Thabo Mbeki bears a great deal of responsibility for it. He was focused on things he probably should have been focused on and neglected what was happening in the party. I mean, the ANC, they're responsible for what they've become. And, you know, it's interesting because Johnny Steinberg penned a recent article that was published, or an op-ed, talking about the first 15 good years and the second bad 15 years. And he was called to account and task on that by, I think Tony Leon is actually the one that called him a little bit to task on that and said, well, that's not entirely accurate. And I will call Johnny Steinberg a noted crime reporter and very, very, very good gentleman, but I will call him to task too. It, in my view, was never a good 15 years. There were always problems from the outset, but many of us were willing to overlook those problems because of the tremendous challenges that South Africa faced as it transitioned from what was to what could be. But the problem is that if you look objectively from the very beginning, it was all there. The authoritarianism of the ANC, its closing of ranks, its refusal to punish its miscreants, and its total disdain and callous disregard for black South Africans has been there from the very beginning. They've just painted over it. Now, the problem, let me finish this here. The problem with this, from my perspective, is that there were well-intentioned ANC members and leaders. And there may still be some. They're just not open and they're silent at this moment. But there were. I mean, there were also some very talented people in ANC governments. Trevor Manuel was very good at many of the things he did, and he's not alone. But the point is that I disagree with Johnny Steinberg and agree partially with Tony Leon that it's always been there. It's just that many of us were willing to overlook it for a long time. Would you agree or disagree? Or you usually have a slightly different take than I do, so let's get your take on that.
Yeah, so I suppose part of it is to work out why were South Africans' fortunes quite good for those 15 years, in the sense that you had economic growth, you had a lot of service delivery, more access to water and housing, electricity. Some of that has to do with the kind of Mandela miracle stuff. So I think a lot of the nations around the world were rooting for South Africa, that it was seen as a country on the brink of civil war, and that we had a peaceful transition was seen as a spectacular feat. And some of that had to do with kind of charisma of Mandela. And some of it had to do with it being a good time in terms of economic history. So, one reason why you might think that South Africa's fortunes changed in 2008 was the global financial crisis, and that we hadn't built up the right sort of system to deal with it. As I mentioned earlier, that there were certain kinds of seeds planted by Mbeki that were dangerous. So there was a brief moment in South African history where we took the idea of non-racialism quite seriously. It's in Section 1 of our Constitution. The idea is that you don't judge people based on the color of their skin, but rather on the content of their character. That great Martin Luther King line. And at some point, that view dissolves. And the idea is that we must very seriously use race in our public policy. So, and part of the argument is that it's used as a corrective device to undo the wrongs of the past, but it becomes a dangerous medicine, because once you start to classify people on the grounds of race again, by the way, the Population Registration Act, which had classified people on the grounds of race during apartheid, was abolished in 1991, never replaced. So we just have this sort of ad hoc social way of classifying people on the grounds of race. And when you do that, and then you elevate people into positions of power on the basis of their race as opposed to their abilities, you will create problems. So the poor, often black, who require the aid of the state, really require the best of the best to come up with those policies, to provide those resources. And so if you're picking people on some other arbitrary attributes, like their hair color, their height, their eye color, or the color of their skin, instead of how good they are at the job, there are going to be second order effects from that. And that's a policy that comes out under Mbeki. So there is that danger that he re-racialized South Africa, that there was an opportunity to have really embraced non-racialism, and embraced policies that are about freedom, that are about growth, about market opportunities, that the best way to lift people out of poverty is not through government but through business, that businesses are much better employers, that you want a number of businesses to grow, that's a better way of shaping your environment. The ANC, its main coalition partner is the African Communist Party, and a lot of those terrible ideas from the Soviet Union are still deeply baked into the party, and they are very good for the ANC. So if the idea is that the state must have total control over everything, and that the state will dish out the contracts, well, then it doesn't really care so much if the poor are going to be shafted by poor service delivery, because their friends are going to get those contracts. So you can ensure that there's a creamy layer of people who do incredibly well, that they'll donate back to the party for the deals that you've given them. And so if you're in the upper echelons, you've made the right strategic choice. Of course, you have to be a sociopath who doesn't really care about the poor, but that appears to be part and parcel for the modern ANC.
Well, I can't disagree with that at all. That certainly seems to be part and parcel for who the ANC is in the 21st century, and it's painfully obvious. I mean, the callous disregard. I mean, how can any ANC politician not be up in arms and angry and screaming about children dying in pit latrines? I mean, it's unbelievable. We have another 3-year-old child dying in a pit latrine in the Eastern Cape. 400 schools in the Eastern Cape remain without abolition units 30 years after the change in dispensation. Now, the amount of money stolen in PPE theft alone by ANC officials would have built abolition units for all of those schools if that was the focus. It's unbelievable. I mean, I built abolition units in Liberia for the Army and in communities, and did it for hundreds of dollars, not millions of dollars. I mean, this is an absolute disgrace, and that's really who the ANC are in the 21st century. They, for the longest time, I've been irritated by them. I think Anthea Jeffrey, who also has a relationship with the Institute for Race Relations, would probably agree with me. I won't speak for her, but I believe she will, based on her writings, that the ANC has always had this bent to where they're focused on their inner circle and their needs and not others. And you see it play out in things like that. But, one of the reasons why the period was good for the ANC, particularly from the turn of the millennium until about 2008, when the financial crisis began, is the boom in global commodities sparked by the Chinese entry into the World Trade Organization, and then, of course, illegally using protectionism to protect their marketplace while they became the workshop of the world. And so China's boom, needing all these resources from all over the world, that's what drove it. I remember a bag of parboiled rice in Liberia was $16 when I arrived there. But a year later, it was $67 because the price of rice was driven up because the Chinese were buying every commodity under the sun. So those salad days, South Africa didn't plan for when that boom would stop. And on top of that, a lot of the things that South Africa sells as commodities aren't really big contributors anymore. In 1980, mining contributed over 23% of the GDP for South Africa. Today, it's 7.5% and declining and collapsing. But here's an anecdotal example for you, and maybe it's not fair, but I think it's indicative. You were talking about how Black South Africans suffer because of this wrong-headed policy that's really just racist. That's not your word, but that's my word. Racist when you make decisions based on appearance or affiliation or origin or language or religion. In George, where this building collapsed yesterday, you see the photographs of the specialized rescue workers from fire and emergency services who were there. George's population is 25%. Now, to be fair, people came in from Cape Town because they deploy those forces. But Cape Town is also a place with a smaller white population. Yet 99% of the people on the scene rescuing those trapped in the building happen to be white South Africans. That's an anecdotal example. But the point here is that in many places in South Africa, those people aren't available because they've been pushed out of the job sector by these wrong-headed policies. It's really sad. What about would you agree with the commodities boom playing a big role in bringing revenue into South Africa? And any thoughts on that anecdotal example?
Yes, so you're right that the commodities boom played a big role and that South Africa's economy has transitioned. I mean, despite all of the very strong headwinds that South African businesses have to deal with. So you've got load shedding, you've got water shedding, you've got race-based policies that make it difficult to get jobs. You still have an absolutely incredible private sector here. You have really impressive innovation. Some of that probably has to do with it being a difficult environment. So if you have to come up with ingenious solutions because of difficulties, you wind up with quite impressive things. So South Africa's banking system is one of the best in the world, partly because we had very ingenious fraudsters.
Well,
So
Mark, let me interrupt you for just a second there. Sorry, and I agree with you 100%. And we have an historical example of this. The National Party had to adapt, and they perfected the Ribbentrop process, the Tropsch-Ribbentrop process for conversion of coal into liquids and gases. So that process also, many of the state enterprises, the weapons in the domestic weapons industry, which produced the best artillery piece in the world, the G5, and the list goes on, because necessity is the mother of invention. I mean, it's a trite phrase, but it's really true. And South Africa, under apartheid, in order to survive, the government had to be creative. It had to spur innovation, and it did. Even for a government-controlled economy, it was pretty innovative, to be honest. I mean, it was really a socialist economy, in my view. But today, because of the socialist economy imposed on South Africans who are trying to avoid it, the private sector has to be very creative and entrepreneurial. Sorry to interrupt, but I thought that's a good example to bring in there.
yeah, I mean, you're right, first of all, to mention that the apartheid government was not a capitalist government, and that this was totalitarian, that you had a lot of liberties taken away from people. I often think, one way to get a sense of the prosperity between then and now is go and look at your old family photos and get a sense of what your lounge looked like in comparison to what it looks like now. But yeah, in terms of innovation in our private sector, because we've sort of moved in some senses towards more of a free market, despite a lot of the obstacles in place by the ANC, the banking system looks very impressive. So friends of mine who moved to North America were quite surprised that they had to pay with checks, something that we've of course abolished in South Africa.
Well, you don't have to pay with checks. It's an option. I'm not sure why they had to pay with checks. I mean, I paid with bank transfer and have been doing it for 25 years. But I mean, I think that's maybe they're just not familiar with our system. But yes, your system is advanced. Sorry.
Yeah, these were requests from landlords who would say, please, can we have 6 post-dated checks?
Well, that's someone gaming the system. That's a very different situation.
Yes, but it's so there's a sense that we're at a bit of a precipice moment in South Africa. We've got elections coming up in a few weeks. It's regarded as the most important elections for the last 30 years, and there's a couple of different scenarios. And the IR has played quite a big role in coming up with what those scenarios look like and how to plan for them. So their prior CEO, Frans Cronje, had written a book called A Time Traveler's Guide to South Africa, looked at what South Africa would look like in 2030. And the one scenario was that you have a move towards classical liberalism, so that things are freer, that markets are freer, and the other one is that you wind up with very pernicious forces taking over, and that South Africa kind of breaks up into a series of enclaves, so that some people are able to lead lives that are prosperous in, let's say, gated communities, while others are imperiled by a failed state and roving gangs. And in some senses, that breakup scenario looks more and more likely. In terms of different possibilities past the election, the polls show the ANC dipping below 50. And so there will be a government coalition of sorts. And I suppose the question is what that looks like. I'll ask you to come up with some scenarios and then I can catch my breath.
Oh, actually, I have a number of scenarios. I've done a video on this, which is not getting much play here, unfortunately, because I don't know, it just doesn't get traction. Maybe it's the IP address, maybe it's YouTube censorship. But I did a South Africa post-election scenario for, and I even named them. I even came up with names. At least if I can find them real quick. One of them, of course, was the Armageddon scenario. In the Armageddon scenario, the ANC is able to form a coalition with MK and with the EFF, and that would lead to the complete demise of South Africa and corruption as rent-seeking continues unabated, and they just pilfer everything. Another one I came up with was a grand coalition where the multi-party charter, despite what it claims, goes into coalition with the ANC out of necessity, and it's a slow demise. Another one where the DA betrays its voters and it claims they'll never go into it. And so, but anyway, I got like 4 or 5 scenarios. I made a video explaining, I got the Zimbabwe for South Africa scenario. That was where the DA goes into coalition with the ANC, and it's just like a repeat of Zimbabwe in 2008 when Mugabe lost the election, stole the events, and then the SADC intervened and said, well, okay, we have a government of national unity, which if you start hearing that phrase in South Africa, you should get very nervous, because the way that played out in Zimbabwe was that the MDC under Morgan Tsvangirai was given the ceremonial post of prime minister, reinvented. It didn't exist under the current constitution in the previous one. It was one that came in 1980, abolished in 1988, and he had no power whatsoever. They gave the finance minister to Tendai Biti, who was talented and dollarized the economy and saved Zimbabwe from total collapse, and they started growing economically again. And some minor things like tourism. But the state security cluster, the military, the police, intelligence, all stayed under ZANU-PF, and those scumbags still run the country today. I see a very similar scenario if the DA were to go into coalition with the ANC. They would get the finance ministry, they would get tourism, they would get, something like that. But justice, the police, the military, all that would stay under the ANC, and the country would continue to decline just at an arrested pace. Anyway, that's just a quick synopsis of some of my scenarios. I don't know what the IRR came up with, but those I came up with on my own volition.
Yeah, I suppose there's different ways of viewing those grand coalitions, as you say. One is that it looks like Zim, or it looks like what happened with the Lib Dems and the Tories, and that the DA come in as a minority partner. Maybe they're able to institute some reforms, but not sufficiently, and that they're ultimately blamed for a lot of the woes South Africa sees in the next 5 years, and that leads to an obliteration of the party or seen as sellouts, which is what happened to the MDC and to the Lib Dems. I suppose there's a scenario where the Charter and the ANC receive similar support from the electorate, and so that grand coalition sits at around 70%, 35% for each party, and that if the MPC are strong-willed enough, they don't make the mistake of taking departments that are useless, like, let's say, sports or arts and culture, and that they work out where the correct levers are. And that story goes differently, so that the MPC then are able to grow. There's a different version, which is that in order to avoid the doomsday scenario, the DA or the MPC strike a deal with the ANC, which is to say, we're not going to participate in your government, we're not going to have a government of national unity, we're not going to take up any ministerial seats, we will support your budget, we'll support your president, and nothing else. So any laws that you want to put in that are contrary to our values, we're going to shoot down. And so the ANC will govern as a minority party, that the good guys play a role in protecting the country from the sort of pernicious legislation, but not from the pernicious governance. So you'd still have the problem of the ANC running things, but the idea would be that they continue to run things the way they have, that their support dips even further, and that in the next set of elections, the MP looks stronger, having shot down some of the dangerous bits of legislation. And of course, there are really dangerous bits of legislation floating around.
NHI.
So NHI, without a doubt. A lot of people have said to me that that's the death knell for them. That if that comes in,
they're leaving.
They don't see a future.
Yep.
Yeah, they're going to leave. Appropriate compensation, obviously a concern. The Hate Speech Act could be used for pernicious reasons, silencing speech that's critical of the government, things like that. So I think that the IRR has this important role to play regardless of the outcome. So if you do wind up with the good guys having some influence and power, that the IRR can play a role in saying, well, here are the good policies. These are the things that you ought to be doing, and here are the dangerous policies. Here's what you ought to be, scrapping from our legislative books. The other one is that if we do have the doomsday scenario, that there is going to have to be a serious ramping up of opposition. That, as you say, MK plus the EFF plus the ANC, possibly sitting at 2/3, being able to change the constitution, or as Jacob Zuma says, scrap the constitution, because it's a white supremacist neoliberal thing that must be taken away, and we should return to parliamentary sovereignty, and also have an upper chamber for kings and queens. very very impressive stuff. That
Well, I mean, I'm still chuckling over the 1996 Constitution, which was passed by a vast majority of black members of Parliament, but it's neo-colonialist and white supremacist. That's a chuckling one. But I have been watching Jacob Zuma, and we'll get into that in a second. But I just shaking my head about the whole thing.
Yeah. So I think we're sort of heading for strange days. And the other thing that South Africa is doing, of course, is ruining its reputation with our trading partners. So, I think we've discussed before the ICJ case. This is a terrible idea just from South Africa's self-interest, that you're upsetting, America, the UK, and Europe, who still have good relationships with Israel, and who we do a lot of trading with. That I think we are becoming an object of scorn abroad. That we're seen as aligning with the bad guys, being Iran and Russia. So there's a sense in which if the politics go in the correct direction, there could be a reversal where South Africa sort of joins the good guys in the global community.
Well, that would be a good turn. I just wrote an article for a U.S. Army War Room's website about friend or foe, whose side is South Africa on. And the ANC is really going to great lengths to piss off its partners in the global community. I mean, it's ridiculous. And, it's funny because with people, when I do this analysis, you get, of course, the trolls, and you get people, some of them actually well-meaning, but poorly informed. Or, I talk about how the ANC has no moral credibility whatsoever when it claims that it's taking the high ground against Israel over what it claims is genocide, despite the fact that the actions in Gaza do not meet the definition of genocide by the international community, by even a wide measure. But that aside, where was South Africa when the Gambia took the historic step of accusing Myanmar of genocide against the Rohingya Muslim minority? South Africa was on the sidelines and did nothing. Okay, so, all right, so that's a one-off. Maybe they just were busy. That's fine. Okay, in 2019, they didn't have time for it. But where is South Africa on the 5.5 million people displaced by the RSF and General al-Burhan's forces in Sudan, and millions of people starving there when it's a few 100,000 starving in Gaza, according to the media reports? Where is the ANC on what's happening in the Sahel? Where is the ANC on what's happening in Somalia? Where is the ANC? The list goes on and on and on. The ANC, these are not good actors, and they really are going to great lengths to irritate people. And when I did an objective video about AGOA and said that, listen, AGOA is a gift. It really is. We get virtually no benefit from it. The only thing the United States derives from AGOA is hopefully access to officials in foreign countries, a nice reputation for America, and ultimately what we hope for, democratic, legitimate governments that see to the needs of their population. That's what we're hoping for. But that's just soft stuff. There's nothing tangible there. Whereas South Africa gets duty-free access to our marketplace to the tune of $2.8 billion in trade every year that enters our market without paying any fees, whereas Europeans have to pay 2% tariff at a minimum on their goods, plus more depending on the type of category. We get nothing from it, but South Africa gets everything from it. We're the second largest trading partner with South Africa, 22% of their trade. Only China's larger than us. And we're a major destination for South African wine, for BMW parts. The list goes on and on and on. And all I ever get from South Africans is like, well, you need us. We got minerals. Listen, none of your minerals play a role in the fourth industrial revolution. They have very little to do with the green economy, which they're all enraged with here. So when I do these objective things, all I get is this nasty stuff from people, many of whom mean well, but they're poorly informed. South Africa, under the ANC, is whistling past the cemetery if they don't think that there aren't going to be repercussions for this conduct. I mean, now we've got dozens of flights with using South African military call signs for Russian aircraft flying to the DRC, to Lagos, into South Africa, into Uppington, to Waterkloof. And, they're just like the Lady R, the government's like, well, it's nothing to say here, nothing to see here. It really is pissing off its partners in the West.
Yeah, there's a sense in which South Africans are delusional. So they assume that they hold this very important spot on the global stage.
Yeah.
Because at some point we did.
True.
So, in 94, you had this miraculous story. We were the flavor of the time. And there really was a good story to tell. And so a lot of people, if you ask them about South Africa, will think about, oh, you won the Rugby World Cup and Nelson Mandela. And then you sort of say, and what have we done for you lately? They go, I'm not really sure, actually, now that I think about it. In terms of global GDP output, I mean, I think it's less than 1%. So yeah, this idea that we can do what we like, we can swan around with rogue states, and there'll be no repercussions for us because everybody needs us.
Well, in
This is
fact,
not the
sorry, Mark, but there's two things that come to mind in minerals. Well, South Africa, everyone needs your gold. No, South Africa has dropped to the 10th largest producer of gold in the world. Your gold is so deep, and it's not profitable in many cases to dig it out because of the cost of going so deep in the mines. Whereas China is the world's #1 producer of gold. China, the U.S., Australia, Russia, always, and Canada in the top 5. And the South Africans are producing, it fluctuates. They went from 10th to 6th and then back down 8th, but they're not a major producer of gold anymore. And on top of that, the platinum group will save us. No, the platinum group is becoming less important. The major use for platinum was for catalytic converters in internal combustion engines. And as these lunatics push us towards electric vehicles, you don't need those anymore. So South Africa, and also, we're an important spot here. The global traffic goes through the Suez. But the Suez, that's a temporary thing. The thing we were told was going to be shut down for a year when the ship ran it to the side. It was just a matter of weeks and it was back up. And besides, if people go around South Africa, they're more likely these days to stop in Walfish Bay than they are to stop in Durban or Cape Town, where it takes days and weeks to get into the port. It's prohibitively expensive. You got to deal with corruption, incompetence, and anyway. So sorry, but I couldn't resist getting that piece in there about the gold.
There's another reason why we've plummeted, as you say, from the world's top gold producer to 10th. We've made mining very, very difficult in South Africa.
BE.
We've got you've got BE, you've got the mining charter. You've got very few new mining projects. That the ones that are operating kind of keep going under very difficult conditions, but we've made it very tough. And so when you basically say South Africa is not open for business in that area, why the hell would anybody put some money in? And mining is a long-term investment. It's very expensive. It might take you 10, 15, 20 years before you start making money. And if you say, well, you might confiscate my assets, you might force people onto my company that I don't want to deal with, I can actually go elsewhere. There are other countries in the world besides you guys. So, as I say, that South African delusion that we're the only game in town will have consequences. As you point out, there are some good reasons why people should do deals with us. But we need to do a lot of soul searching before we become a destination that's open and worth it, and we start removing some of those barriers.
A lot of those barriers are simply own goals. They're wholly unnecessary. There's no reason, even if the government was bent on being a socialist government, they still made own goals. BEE, that's not socialist. That's patronage. I mean, that never should have existed. I said at the very beginning, there were like 3 things that I talked about back in '94. And as a young officer in the military, people asked me, because they knew I was focused on Africa, and they said, so what's going to happen in South Africa? I said, well, we'll see. It's been pretty dicey the past couple of years, 92 to 94, with what was happening with the Nicklin and such. And anyway, I said, South Africa has a lot of potential. It can go a long ways, but they've got to fix some things. Number one, the police have got to be turned from an instrument that protects minority South Africans who see almost no violent crime. They're well protected. It's got to be turned into an institution that does community policing, where people know the cop on the corner. They go to the cop and go, hey, listen, Isaac just stole over there from the candy shop. They're willing to tell people stuff and they cooperate with them. That's the first thing. Second thing is that they really need to get the economics right. And what I mean by the economics is that what they should do, because I saw it already unfolding at the time, is that they were doing the shakedown of the big corporations like Anglo American, Old Mutual, and organizations like that to shake them down for equity. Well, that's morally wrong, but if you are going to shake them down for equity, maybe the equity should go into a national sovereign wealth fund that grows assets over time and pays out a stipend to South Africans based on a tiered system of economic need or something like that. And then you create a culture of ownership, an ownership society where they say, oh, look, I've got this, and it's getting better because the country's getting bigger. And the third thing they had to fix was education. And we had 2 generations or more of people in the liberation movement who were, many of them, poorly educated because they went into the bush or they went to Angola or they simply refused to go to school because I'm not speaking Afrikaans in school, And so you have a lot of South Africans who didn't get a formal education and really need that to be successful in the fourth industrial revolution, which we weren't calling at the time, but the next wave. So education, policing, because if you don't have security, you have nothing. I mean, look at how much money people waste on security guards and security systems and all that stuff in South Africa. So security, then you had to fix the economy. Instead of doing it the way they did it, I would have done it differently. Now, Ramaphosa came in 2017, early 2018, he took over, and he said, I'm going to create a national sovereign wealth fund. This guy just says what people want to hear. There's no national sovereign wealth fund. There's no effort to take the resources that was given to people like him and others and put into a pot and dole it out to people. So anyway, those three things. But none of those three things have been fixed. The police are a disaster. Black South Africans, there's 3 or 4 times as many living in abject poverty as there was in 1994. That's an incredible accomplishment by the ANC, pushing all those people into poverty with its stupid policies. And then education's a joke. 30, 30, 30 in 3 subjects and 40% in your first language, and you're told you pass high school. Of course, you'll never get in university with those grades, so you're unemployable. We do need BEE, Mark, and I've already said this in other broadcasts. BEE is basic enhanced education, or basic education enhanced. Okay? So what I mean by that is all these people have graduated in the last decade who don't have a high school education but have a piece of paper saying they're a high school graduate should be given free tertiary or secondary, post-secondary education to get educated, to be literate and functional in society, and a stipend to go along with it because they're already adults and they might even have families already. That's what has to be fixed. Policing, the economy, and education. Anyway, your thoughts?
Yeah, those are things that are important. So one of the things that the IRR has been doing for a long time is producing this thing called the South African Survey. Partly because, during apartheid, the state was pretty bad at providing stats that were reliable. And so, Helen Suzman always said, if you want to know what's going on, you've got to see for yourself. And so the IRR's job partly was to say, well, let's find out what's going on. Let's find out what the levels of poverty look like, the levels of electricity penetration. And so this book is freely available from the IRR's website and provides fascinating information. A lot of which, once people realize what the true facts are on the ground, they realize what the priority issues ought to be. So I did a submission to Parliament on expropriation without compensation because the narrative at the time was nothing has happened with regards to land reform, and we have to have this radical solution, which is give the state the power to expropriate so that we can right the wrongs of the past.
But that's a false narrative, is it not?
Yeah. So I relied on the IRR's data, which looks at, well, how many people actually did receive compensation. And it turns out that between 1995 and I think it's 2014, 1.8 million individuals received compensation either in the form of money or land for land that was stolen. So this idea that there's this burning issue and no one's been helped just wasn't true. You actually had a system in place which meant that many of those wrongs were righted. The other thing that came out was when people were asked, do you want money or land? 90% of people said, I'd like the money, please. That they didn't want a piece of rural land in the middle of nowhere. They wanted money so they could start their own business or buy a piece of land in an area of their choosing. So providing those stats was pretty useful. You also get a sense that IRA does a lot of polling to work out what people's main priority issues are. And so employment is consistently up there. Crime is a concern, education is a concern. Things like racism and land reform tend to trickle down into the bottom percents. So there's a sense in which the ANC government is focusing on the wrong stuff. Interesting thing about education in South Africa is that there's a possibility of leapfrogging. So if you think about how traditional education works, you have to build quite an expensive infrastructure. You've got to have classrooms and teachers and the transport network to get there. We're now in a situation where there's many more cell phones in South Africa than there are people, with access to the world's wisdom. And so what you want really is a structure that lets people access that and be accredited through courses that they can do online. And I think some of that has to do with the change in social conditions as well. So a lot of people study not because they want the knowledge, but because they want a certificate at the end. And they think the certificate is their pathway to a job. And actually the skills are very important. My cousin used to head up one of the biggest scholarship foundations in South Africa, the Marshall Scholars Foundation. Very interesting organization. So their policy was not to take the best and the brightest. It was to take students that were poor and vulnerable and did not qualify for any other scholarship. So it was those that would have fallen through the cracks. And so a lot of students that they worked with, grew up in poor townships. One of the girls talked about, her mother and her sister and her sharing one bed in a shack. And their policy was, we're only going to fund degrees where we think it's going to be worthwhile. So STEM degrees and law degrees, not arts degrees. The usual attrition rate, by the way, for people who start studying university is very high. So when I was at UCT, only a third of people who started would actually get a law degree. Their throughput rate for the Michelle Scholars is 90%. So that means 9 out of 10 people who start will get their degree. And what's interesting about that is you're dealing with people who are quite vulnerable, so you'd expect the dropout rate to be higher. But they did some quite cheap interventions. So they created a psychosocial network of support. So the Michelle Scholars would have to see each other 4 times a year. They're from all around the country. They would have conferences. They would have mentors that they could talk to about whatever was going on in their lives. And that there was a peer support network. That there was a sense that we are involved in an important initiative. We owe it to the other Michelle Scholars to thrive. That every year they would have a breakfast with various corporate South Africans. And Martin Michelle would say, I don't want your money to the corporates. He says, we've paid for their degrees. I'm not saying you have to hire these people, but I'm just saying have an interview with them. There are some remarkable people here. We've picked people who've gone through adversity, who've come on the other end with amazing degrees from great universities in the country. Meet with them. And so a lot of them would go to these breakfasts and sort of realize, if I keep working hard and I get my degree, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And there's an incentive for those employers to have students who actually know what they're doing. One of the stories I remember, I mentioned this girl who stayed in one bed with her entire family. She said after she got her honours degree in maths, being a very difficult thing to obtain, she got her first job. The first thing she did was buy her mother a proper bed for herself. And so, education really can be a multiplier. One of the reasons why Michelle had sort of invested in it, to say you can affect not just the lives of those directly, but indirectly, their families as well will benefit. And it's good for the nation when you have all these smart, innovative people doing wonderful things. The other thing that's interesting about South Africa, of course, is that, as you say, some of the schools are probably some of the worst in the world, but we also have some of the best. University of Cape Town is still regarded as the top university on the continent, despite many, many own goals. The Fees Must Fall movement being up there for destroying a lot of its infrastructure, burning art, and library burnt down, making a lot of brilliant staff flee the campus. But there's still rope there. And it's one of the reasons why I ran in their election for council, which is to say this is an institution worth saving. It's an institution that has produced some of the most remarkable South Africans who've played a role not just here, but abroad.
No, absolutely. The difference that you're talking about there is with Michelle is that people who are engaged, people who care, people who are innovative and think of ways. I remember as an undergraduate at Ohio University, there was nothing by the university to do anything to encourage us to graduate or to set up employment, that sort of thing. It was just sort of expected. But I mean, that's an institution that dates from 1804, and that's what happened. People graduated and they go into the workforce. What they did do is allow recruiters and fairs to take place on campus. They provide those facilities, but I mean, it's not like the university was setting that up. I mean, it's very innovative and very forward thinking of those folks to think about that. And I think that's fantastic. We're not asking you to hire these people. Just, have a conversation with them. I think you'll be surprised. You might want to hire them. Here's some talent that you probably never had a chance to see. And the knock-on effect of that, and that's why I'm so hard on education. I mean, education is a lifelong thing for me. And I've gone multiple universities, multiple degrees, undergraduate, postgraduate degrees, no PhD though, but multiple postgraduate degrees. And even just in 2022, I was with Michigan State University taking their beekeeping course to become a qualified beekeeper. They did offer free tuition for veterans. That was one of the incentives, so thank you for that. But that was otherwise like a $15,000 program. So I completed that program. So and I've done education every way you can imagine, Mark. I mean, I've done it resident. I've done it through correspondence back in the day before we had internet, where you had to mail your papers in and stuff like that. I've done it with a weekend course where you go for a weekend. I've done it where you go 2 nights a week. I've done distance education before people even heard of distance education back in 1995 on the Iowa Community Network, using a fiber optic network with multiple campuses and in a classroom. So I've done it every way imaginable. And education is the path to success. It really is. And that is such a shame that has been so degraded in South Africa when it needed to be uplifted. I mean, South Africa's always had some of the absolute best schools on the planet for kids. I mean, kids all over the world would be sent there by parents to go to South African schools because the quality was so good. And some of those schools still remain. And many of the public schools are very good, but we're talking primarily about schools that were targeted for minorities that were very good. Instead of maintaining that standard and uplifting the rest, the ANC's managed to lower the standard and ruin many of these schools, and that's so sad to see. But that's a great story you shared there about what those guys were doing. That is the future, especially now, and innovative ways to do it. But we got to fix it. I mean, there's generations of South Africans who are not up to the task of working in the modern workplace, and we need them to be up to the task, or South Africa will just be an economic also-ran.
Yeah, very much so. There's a sense that there's a lot of potential to be unleashed here. And a lot of South Africans really want to make the place work. I mean, there's a reason why people haven't fled in droves. Some of it might be foolishness, some of it might be a sense of hope and realizing that there's a lot to love here. I mean, the fact that you come out and you visit and you say, what a spectacular place. When I drive around the country, I'm often blown away at how much potential there is. But I also think how quickly you can ruin a place. You sort of think about a place like Venezuela, where you adopt terrible policies, and you can have millions of people having to flee the country for their survival. People going on the Maduro diet because they've lost all their wages, and the value of the currency is sunk. Or the millions of Zimbabweans who've fled not just South Africa but all around the world. I met up with a Polish diplomat recently who said that 10% of the applications to go to Poland are from Zimbabweans. So there's a sense in which you've got a populace that's just desperate to get out. But South Africa does have some incredible things. One of the things that a friend said to me recently was that we have some truly brilliant people in business, but not many brave people. And I think that's one of the failures in leadership, is that it's quite hard to stick your neck out and tell the powers that be that they're doing the wrong thing. That businesses generally try and do what's in their short-term self-interest. So they've cozied up to the ANC government, that they've gotten certain kinds of benefits, especially if you're in big business. Things like BE might actually be to your benefit because it makes it very hard for small businesses to compete with you. They can't deal with the regulatory burden, but at scale you can do it. And so that suits you. You can actually avoid genuine competition. But we will be smothered to death eventually by the ANC government and their terrible policies. And of course, that smothering will be deeply accelerated. The pillow will be thrust up your nose if Julius and Jacob get a chance to do it. That the slow death will become a very rapid one. So it's important that people stand up and they push back against that. And we need more brave souls to take up the fight.
Well, big business always loves big government because, as you alluded to or you stated, it crowds out competition. It crushes entrepreneurialism. Oligarchies and monopolies. Look, Google has a search monopoly. Is there any antitrust investigation in the United States against Google for that? Nope, not a single one. But boy, they went after AT&T back in the day. They went after IBM back in the day. And when they broke up AT&T, it actually unleashed a lot of innovation. We wound up with mobile networks and development of all that stuff took place, fiber optic networks. The IBM thing was just a huge waste of government resources and time, and IBM wound up innovating on its own. But anyway, the point is that, big business loves big government, and it's no different in South Africa than it is in America. Hey, let's shift focus a little bit here. New Kids on the Block, and I'm not talking about the boy band. I'm talking about Mkhonto Sizwe. Boy, a month ago, they looked to be on fire in the press. I mean, all the good press they were getting, and the Ipsos poll, and before the Ipsos poll, it was the Brenthurst poll that put them at 13%, something like that. Wow, they're surging. And I'm not saying they're not surging, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, but they're there's been a lot of bad news the past few days. Kumalo, the founder of the party, was ejected. Now he's filing a lawsuit against Zuma. And Zuma, the case from the Independent Electoral Commission has gone to the Constitutional Court, I guess, to declare. I don't see how Jacob Zuma is even remotely eligible for office. I've read the Constitution, and there's nothing in it that says a rescission negates a conviction, anyway, but things are not going as well for MK this week as they were a month ago. Nonetheless, there's still a big thorn in the ANC side, particularly in Gauteng and in KZN. Any thoughts on Jacob Zuma and his new party of Liberation Era lookalikes?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I think South Africans have been talking about a split in the ANC for a long time, and what we've always had are little shavings falling off. So, COPE or the
EFF, yeah.
Yeah. So they're all part of the same body. I mean, if you read MK's manifesto, I mean, it's some seriously dangerous.
I read it. Sorry. I read it and I did an analysis of it. It is a thoroughly racist, scary document. I mean, unbelievable. I did an analysis on it. That video is posted as well last week. I read the whole thing, and it is. I mean, you don't have to go very far. You just start in the preamble and you just see how scary this is. I mean, the concept of a rainbow nation, of non-racialism, is out the window. It's we're not Roman, we're not Dutch, and these alien creatures that have crawled into our midst, they've done everything except call minorities cockroaches in that document.
Yeah, without a doubt, right? And I suppose if you're a psychopath and you think, how can I possibly get some votes? Well, you lean into certain kinds of, atavistic impulses that people have. Like, you're downtrodden and these people took advantage of you, and I'm going to uplift you, and let's focus in on, ethnic identity. So the idea of a Zulu nationalism. You saw that it wasn't just the ANC that sort of lost some support to MK, but also the IFP. So that's part of it. A friend of mine was recently in Durban to run a marathon. He said pictures of Jacob everywhere. A lot of people very upset with the ANC and feel betrayed, and they sort of think, well, what are our options? Maybe in the early days of Zuma, they thought that they were doing well, that there was a sense of cultural pride. I mean, of course, a bizarre thing to give this guy power after the hollowing out of the institutions that he was engaged in. I mean, Zuma really did some pretty awful stuff. I think Ramaphosa has continued to do awful things. But yeah, in terms of the litigation, that's very interesting. So as you say, the Constitutional Court will have to decide whether Mr. Zuma is eligible to stand for office. The Electoral Court has said that he is. Basically, it's an interpretation of a section of the legislation which says that if you were sentenced to a period of greater than 1 year and the appeal process has been exhausted, then you cannot stand for office. So there were two questions that came up in the litigation. The one is, given that there was a remittance of sentence, so not a pardon, not saying, we forgive you, but to say, because the prisons are overcrowded, we're going to let a certain class of people go free, and Zuma happened to fall into that class on the day that he was heading off to prison. I mean, the coincidence is wild, of course. And I imagine Ramaphosa is a little upset about granting that remittance.
Sometimes it's just good to be lucky, It just happened to be his good fortune.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there was nothing else beyond that. Just a lucky guy. So the question is, well, does that change the fact that you were sentenced to 15 months by the Constitutional Court? Well, no. That didn't change the sentence at all. There'd be an argument about a pardon, possibly, on the grounds that it sort of could expunge your conviction, as if you had never been convicted. So maybe that would be...
But he wasn't pardoned.
Not pardoned. So then the second part, which the Electoral Court has sympathy for, is this idea, well, you were sentenced by the Constitutional Court, so there was no prospect of an appeal, because it's the highest court in the land. You couldn't go to another body and say, hold on a second, this was wrong on the merits or wrong on the amount of time. You just go directly to jail, right? And so the argument is that because there was no possibility of appeal, that the entire portion of the act doesn't apply. In other words, he is immune in the circumstances. The other way of reading, of course, to say, well, given that there was no prospect of appeal, the appeal section just isn't operable. In other words, we say, if you are in a situation where an appeal lies and you haven't fully exhausted it because you're in the appeal process, in other words, we haven't fully determined that you're going to serve the 15 months, well, then you're eligible. Once we determine that you could become ineligible.
But that's
But
not
it's
the case here because there is no appeal process for the
because
Concord.
there's no appeal process.
So that's
So
null and void in my view.
yeah, so I think that's a reasonable interpretation. Of course, there is a sense in which the electoral court may very well, instead of deciding on the basis of the law, is deciding on the basis of political expediency. So there is a prospect that there'd be mass electoral violence if Zuma wasn't allowed to become a member of parliament or stand for president, and so the view is to bend the rules so that he can go there. Now, of course, this is a question the Constitutional Court will have to determine. The IR, by the way, have applied to be a friend of the court in that case. And that, as far as I know, I think that case will be argued on Friday. So I think we all watch with bated breath to see how that turns out.
So how does that work for you guys? Do you file an amicus brief then, or are you president of the court, or how's it work?
Yes, so the IR filed an amicus brief. There's a question as to whether they'll be admitted. It's obviously done on very short timelines. The first time the IR went to court was on whether our election should be postponed, so in 2021. And the IR took the view that it was very dangerous to postpone our elections, that once you create a precedent like that, obviously you open up the doors to hell, that elections could be postponed for all sorts of other reasons. And ultimately, the court found that our elections had to go ahead despite COVID. And so I represented them in the Constitutional Court in that matter.
Speaking of representing in the Constitutional Court, I don't know that you're able to comment on this, but I'll ask the question. If you can't, then we'll respect that. But of course, two cases, one of which you were involved in, that involved Julius Malema and the so-called hate speech AfriForum case, I believe it was. Is that still lingering out there? Is there an appeal? Or I mean, are you able to talk about that yet? And the second was, one of the viewers asked about if you had any comments about Julius Malema and the firearm case, which seems to be keeping delayed forever. I don't think you're involved in that one. And I mean, if you're able to comment, great. If you're not, then we'll respect that.
Yes, I can give you a sense of where the Kill the Boer case is at the moment. So I can't make a comment about what the outcome could be, given that I'm involved in it. But basically, you had the High Court trial before the Equality Court, which is available to watch. In that matter, it was found that calling for white people to be slaughtered doesn't amount to hate speech. Matter was then taken on appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal and argued. I acted for the Rule of Law Project, and Jeremy Gauntlet acted for AfriForum in that matter. We, as the Rule of Law, argued that it's very important that you apply the rules equally, regardless of who the complainant is and who the subject is. That we mustn't have different rules for different races, and we definitely shouldn't have different rules for politicians. So, everyone must be equal before the law. After that case was argued, it was discovered by AfriForum that one of the judges in that case, Judge Keatley, had in a prior matter, in a leave to appeal application, where she had dismissed AfriForum's case and then on leave to appeal, granted leave to appeal, but said in any future matter you should ask for my recusal, and then made various statements about AfriForum, implying that she thought that they were an organization doing the wrong thing, would be one way of putting it. And so then AfriForum then asked for her to recuse herself, and there was an opposed recusal hearing, which was heard. And so we await judgment in the merits and the recusal, which could be two-parter. It could be that Judge Keatley does recuse herself or is recused by the other members of the court. It's a 5-person court. That could mean that the rest of the court makes a decision. It could mean that the court then says the matter must be heard again, so that a fresh panel of judges hear it. It could be that recusal doesn't happen and then a merits decision is made simultaneously. So we await. As far as I know, there is currently a process of applicants for seats at the Supreme Court of Appeal. Mr. Malema has been a member of the Judicial Services Commission, which is the body that basically picks judges for the last 10 years. I think he's the longest serving member. And Judge Keatley was an acting judge at the time, is seeking a permanent role at the SCA at the moment.
Now, the other case that one of the viewers asked about, and I don't think you're involved in this. That's the one with the firearm. That seems to keep getting delayed. We still don't have that resolved. That's the one where allegedly someone on his team changed the receiver in the rifle that he purportedly fired into the air. Of course, I watched the video. So, but anyway, well, I can't attest that there was live ammunition. I can just attest that he fired a weapon in the air. But and any news on that? Because I think people are just curious. I mean, Malema. He must have an army of lawyers at his beck and call because he's always doing something to go to court.
Yes. As far as I know, there isn't resolution in that case. I can say something quite troubling, which is that while I was arguing Kill the Boer, we got a lot of quite bad public attacks against us and against me in particular. And my view is that as a lawyer, you've got to take it on the chin and argue the case as best as you can. But the prosecutor in that case resigned from the NPA to avoid prosecuting it. And she said, I don't want to go through what Mark went through. I'm not willing to subject myself to that. So there is a sense in which Malema's antics pay off. They make it more difficult to hold him to account. So I think, a new prosecutor had to be found the day before the hearing. There was a postponement. And that matter, as you say, drags on.
Well, that's really unfortunate, intimidating the judiciary. That's a shame. We've seen it here in the States. During the Dobbs decision, we saw activists violating federal law and committing felonies by protesting in front of jurist house. You cannot do that in front of a member of Congress or the cabinet or federal magistrates or federal judges. It's a felony. And law enforcement stood around and watched it happen and did nothing to do it. And it even got so bad that, not related to the Dobbs decision, but Senator Hawley's wife was 9 months pregnant. He was in Missouri traveling at the time, and these protesters came up and beat on her door, putting her through extreme stress as she was 9 months pregnant. Never mind the fact they were trespassing. That's a crime of its own. But nothing was done, and this lawlessness that we tolerate in America is quite frightening. I can understand why the prosecutor would be concerned about safety there in that case. It is quite shameful, the abuse that people heap on others who are just trying to do the right thing. I experienced that myself during the Rugby World Cup. I had this thing going with Nas Bota because he wasn't broadcasting, and we were doing these incredible conversations about I was in France, he was in South Africa, and it was fantastic. But one little turd contacted SuperSport and kept complaining that Nas is associating with a white supremacist, a KKK member, and a racist. And none of that's true. It's all slander and libel, because it was also published online. But they get away with it, and they intimidate people. It's tough to be a right, moral, upstanding person in today's world, but you got to do it. And so kudos to you for taking on that case and sticking around. I appreciate where you're coming from as an attorney. Some of that just comes your way, but it's really over the top. Now, I also just recently stepped forward to run for office, and I didn't do very well. Although, to be fair, I mean, the number of votes I got was actually, I suppose, if you look at it for an unknown person, no one knew who I was actually not bad. But I actually foolishly thought that people would go for the candidate. It was the best candidate, the most experienced, and the most dedicated, and most successful. No, they went for the popularity contest. My kids went to high school with that guy, so I'm going to, that sort of thing. But I learned some very painful lessons. I got to tell you, Mark, one of the people was going to vote for me. I had a volunteer at a polling station. Gave the lady a card, one of my palm cards, like these right here, one of these things, handed it out to her. And then she went into the booth. She came back outside. She says, I was going to vote for Chris, but I didn't. I voted for the Christian. And the guy says, but Chris is a Christian. No. Look, he's a veteran. I appreciate that. Thank him for his service. And his accomplishments are amazing. But he was in the army when Obama was president. And Obama was importing Muslims. So I voted for the real Christian. Never mind the woman's bigotry. Let's just put that aside for a moment. But I mean, if that's the level of intelligence of the electorate, my feelings aren't hurt that I didn't get elected to office. I can do without that. But can you believe that? I mean, that's just one example. People also came out of the booth and said that I support abortion. I mean, I'm on record as being attacked because I'm anti-abortion. I mean, it's unbelievable. Anyway, politics. What a strange bedfellow that is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of famous quote about if you want to lose your faith in democracy, go and spend some time with the average voter.
Or run for office, which is what I did. I lost my faith. Oh, man. Hey, listen, let me ask you, are you still doing Brain in a Vat? Is that something still going on, or are you overwhelmed by events?
No, we still do Brain of Vat, 4 years strong. An episode comes out every single week. We just had the world's most influential philosopher on our show, Peter Singer. Peter's famous for two really big things that were not just impactful in philosophy, but in the real world. The first was he wrote a book in the 1970s called Animal Liberation, and he's just produced a new version of that called Animal Liberation Now, about factory farming and the poor treatment of animals. And the other one was on global charity. So he came up with this very famous thought experiment. As you know, Brain of Vat starts every episode with a thought experiment, and this is one of the most famous ones in town, which is that you're walking along your campus boulevard, and you see a 2-year-old girl playing by the fountain, and as you're walking past, she falls in, and she's drowning. And you think, well, I could save her, but if I do that, I'm going to ruin my new leather shoes, or I could just walk past. And Peter says, well, most people are going to think that you have a moral obligation to reach in and save the 2-year-old girl, even if your shoes are going to get wet. And he thinks, well, if you think you have that obligation to save her life, then you also have an obligation to save the lives of other people who are less proximate. So people in the third world, who are starving or disease-ridden, you could spend some of your money saving their lives. And so that led to a movement called the effective altruism movement, which has its own pitfalls. There's sort of interesting debates about what actually is effective in charity. And Sam Bankman-Fried, being one of the big funders of it, seems to have played some roles in distorting it. But as I say, Singer was highly influential. A lot of people threw a lot of money behind that idea of trying to work out how do we do the most good, with the money that we have. So a wonderful guy to chat to. We've got some amazing guests coming out. So I just interviewed Lionel Shriver, who's a wonderful American author who lives out in the UK. Some of you will know the book she wrote called We Need to Talk About Kevin, which was turned into a movie with Tilda Swinton. The book sold about 1 million copies. And her latest book is called Mania. And it is very funny, very clever, and a little bit too close to our reality. So it's an alternate history book set in 2010. And the idea is that there is a new vogue idea in town, which is called the mental parity movement. The idea that everybody is actually intellectually equal with each other, that we just have different ways of processing, and which means that we should remove all smartest language from our vocabulary. We shouldn't talk about idiots or stupid people or stupid ideas. We shouldn't teach Dostoevsky's The Idiot. We need to, ban a lot of that sort of speech. And she plays out how that world develops over time and the implications of not taking merit very seriously. And there's a way in which that idea sort of seems kind of laughable to us, but in practice we find other ways of ensuring that the least intelligent wind up in our institutions, and also how the intelligentsia wind up being the big cheerleaders for a movement like this, even though it seems like it's contrary to their immediate interests. So we've got that episode coming out on Sunday with her. So yeah, the show is thriving from strength to strength, and some really amazing guests we've had over the years. I think we're now over the 200th episode mark.
That's amazing. Congratulations on that. And that's very thought-provoking. Listen, I'd love to get like Malcolm Gladwell as a guest. He would be incredible. I mean, that guy is fascinating. The things he's been writing all the years, really, really thought-provoking. Dostoevsky, I would recommend not reading it, not because of what her reason was, but because it's boring. Dostoevsky is boring. It is sleep-inducing. I got to tell you, it's not. I did a course as an undergraduate. Ohio University had a 3-tier system of basic education requirements as an undergraduate. So you had your breadth of knowledge, which was basically social sciences. You had to cover like so many credit hours. Then you had to have, that was the second level. The first level was computational. So you had to have English composition, but there were courses that could qualify for it. And then mathematics skills. Then the broader one, which was the social sciences. And then you had the synthesis, which was a one course, and you could take it in your junior or senior year, that was supposed to bring together all the things you've learned and apply it. Well, the course that I took was Politics and Literature of the Soviet Union. In 1988 to 1989, that was my academic year. Talk about, fortuitous timing. The Soviet Union was just months away from collapsing when I took the course. But I read Mother. Oh, God, that was boring. And, of course, we had Dostoevsky. We had lots of other things. But Dostoevsky's course wasn't the Soviet Union, but that was an aside reading. But I'll tell you, that was an interesting course. But anyway, Malcolm Gladwell would be an interesting guest, I think. I don't know about that, if that's something that you would go after. But You do have interesting guests, I have to say that, and congratulations on 200 episodes. That's pretty awesome, given that it's a weekly event. That's pretty impressive.
Thanks. It helps having a wonderful co-host. So Jason Werbelov is phenomenally brilliant, and we've had a team of interns working on the show, who are all American, by the way. They come from Rhodes College in Memphis. We've just taken on our latest intern, Ella Coleman, and it's a wonderful thing for them because they get to be exposed to some of the brightest minds in the world, and they help us edit the show and make sure that our listeners get to engage with it. And one of our prior interns, Jimmy Mellon, is in law school at the moment, and was able to use his time at Brain and Vat to ensure that he got into a great law school and also land a wonderful job for when he graduates. So yeah, it's been a great thing for us and for those that have worked on it.
Well, I have to admit that I'm a little confused from what you said earlier, talking about the most renowned philosopher, and I thought that was Taylor Swift, so I was a little confused when you mentioned obviously, I'm not serious about that. But hey, let me, before we wrap up, let me shift to something else very quickly. Mark, I don't know if you have a finger in the pulse of this, but I'm very disheartened by events here in America and what's happening on our college campuses. America's Jewry is being attacked left and right. Physically attacked on campuses and not just on campus. There are some people standing up for American Jews who are Jews and Christians and even Muslims. We saw that 13 federal judges will refuse to take any law graduates from Columbia University because of the conduct going on there. That may be unfair to some of the graduates, but I think it's meant to send a message, and hopefully it does send a message. But we are seeing some horrific abuses here. I know that there were some challenges in South Africa early on after Hamas's invasion in October. By November, we saw some South African Jews being abused. But I don't know. I don't know if, like I said, I don't know if you have your finger on the pulse of this. Is this? I'm not seeing it in the press, so I'm hoping it's not on the level that we're seeing in America, because it's not just on campuses. That's where it's playing out in the news, but it's also happening all over New York. Jewish business has been attacked, and it's pretty frightening, to be honest. Any thoughts on what's happening in South Africa? And hopefully it's not that bad.
It's been difficult. There's definitely a sense in which the Jewish community feels very betrayed. Jews have played an enormous role in building up South Africa. A lot of Jews were, part of the ANC. That they'd played a role in funding the ANC as well, after the transition. And now feel like they've been slapped in the face. There have been some anti-Semitic incidences. There's been a huge spike in South Africa. There's a very small number of Jews that continue to live here. There were about, I think at its peak, about 150,000. There's now about 50,000. We still play a big role in the economy and in various sectors and as thought leaders. But yeah, it's become uncomfortable. There have been, let's say, pro-Hamas protests, and when people have counter-protested, Christians and Jews, they've been attacked when they've had Israeli flags. Our community has been quite good at not putting its head in the sand and taking the fight to government. We've also brought out some amazing people to kind of give nourishment to the Jewish community. So Douglas Murray was out here recently. Just a wonderful thinker, very, very good at articulating what's happening in Israel and the war and talking about anti-Semitism. He, of course, himself is not Jewish, so that makes a difference when Jews hear from others. I've played as much of a role as I can. I've done about 20 interviews on South African television and radio and podcasts talking about the ITJ case and about Israel and about South Africa and the important role that Jews have to play. It does feel that things get tense at times and then simmer down. There's a conference happening a few minutes walk from my house in Sandton at the convention center, which is an apartheid conference claiming that Israel is an apartheid state. The opening speaker will be Cyril Ramaphosa. So yeah, these things happen. I will say something interesting that Jonathan Jansen, who was a prior president of the Institute of Racial Relations, was there for quite a long time, was the vice chancellor at the Free State, someone who said many sensible things over the years, has said some really astoundingly stupid stuff as well, one of which was to try and shame South African students into engaging in the kinds of protests that you see in Colombia, accusing them of not taking up arms with the poor Palestinians. There was a plan to have a tent camp set up at UCT yesterday. Calls for people to get their tents ready and to occupy UCT. It didn't happen, which shows that a lot of South Africans are quite sensible. They don't have much sympathy for terrorism. They can see that Hamas are a dangerous organization. That I think a lot of South Africans feel enormous sympathy for the hostages who still remain in Gaza. That they acknowledge that Israel is involved in a just war, that it must defend itself and defend its interests. And so some of those really radical ideas haven't taken grip. That there's enough resilience here from South Africans to sort of keep pushing back against that.
Well, a few years ago, I was censored by YouTube. I did a video in response to an EFF march outside Israel's embassy in Pretoria, in which I refuted the claim of apartheid, talking about the number of Arabs and Muslims who served in the IDF, and even been senior general officers who serve in the judiciary. The Knesset has had over 100 Arab members, about a third of them been Muslims. The fact that they all, and so I did this video, and of course EFF black supremacists didn't like it, so they falsely reported my video. I appealed it, and it was taken off, and I was given a strike and kept from broadcasting for some time because of that. I mean, that's I feel more comfortable talking now because YouTube is not censoring videos for the most part that are being objective about Israel. I was objective, and I was censored for it, and that was shameful. But it is quite striking because the Freedom Charter was largely written by South African Jews in 1955. I mean, it was primarily people who did it and brought this kind of vision that eventually led to where we got to. And then, of course, the ANC's ranks were full of Jews, as you said, Joe Slovo, Ronnie Kasrils, the list goes on and on of Jewish leaders in the ANC who played a role here. The thing that got me, though, and Mark, and I don't know if you want to comment on this, but I want to share this, is that when the invasion took place on October 7th, a few weeks after that, a Jewish woman living in Williamsburg in New York City, she wrote an op-ed which appeared in the New York Times. She says, I'm confused. I feel betrayed. I'm a liberal. I vote Democrat all the time. I'm for all the gay causes. I'm for this. I'm against these Republicans and these racists and all this stuff. And I don't understand. I feel so betrayed. All of my friends have abandoned me. And I did a video on that, and I said, well, you feel betrayed because you're foolish. Your true friends were never the people on the political left. They don't truly believe in freedom and liberty and people being able to do their things. Conservatives believe in that. And not all conservatives. There's some wackadoodles and racists on that side of the aisle, but a true conservative believes that people should have their liberty and they should be allowed to practice their faith and live their life as they desire. And I said, you associate with the wrong people. I mean, my friends who are conservatives, they have no problem with Jews. They have no problem with Muslims. We respect and defend their rights, and we respect and defend whites, blacks. We don't care as long as people are treated fairly and equally. I mean, what I just said, I think, is probably the ethos of the IRR, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know if you want to comment on it or not, but that's I wasn't surprised. American Jews tend to vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party, often against their own self-interest. To be fair, there's plenty of reasons not to vote for the Republican Party. I'm not going to dispute that, but the point is that that's been a historic thing. Whereas, excuse me, Black Americans from the 1870s all the way up until the 1930s voted overwhelmingly for the Republican Party out of loyalty for the ending of slavery and for extending citizenship and voting rights. Black men, that is. Black women didn't get to vote till the 1920s with other women. But the point is that that all changed in the 1930s, and now they vote overwhelmingly against their self-interest. It's very frustrating for me when people are confused that they've been betrayed by people who are never their friends.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. There's definitely been a revolt, I think, in the Jewish community of going, we've been allied with the bad guys, that we thought we were involved in a sort of solidarity movement, we would have each other's backs, and it turns out these guys actually hate us. And so I think that there will be a shift in terms of who Jews support. But it is very hard. I mean, a close friend of mine said that she finds it additional salt in the wounds, and that the greatest supporters of Israel, have been those on the right. That she found it surprising. But I think a lot of Jews will sort of realize that they were incorrect about who they were backing before. So there's a sort of strange thing to try and wrap your head around, how you can have a movement like Gays for Gaza, and you sort of think, but if you actually went to Gaza, they would throw you off a building because you're gay.
Yeah.
So why are you doing this deal? And there's a sense, there's a lot of journalists who've gone and interviewed students and said, why are you here? What do you believe in? What's going on? And the responses are just extraordinarily shallow. you get a sense that a lot of people are there for vibes, that they haven't even read the posters that were handed to them that they're holding around. A lot of people, Konstantin Kisin asked people, what is a socialist intifada? It's on your poster. No one can say. So there's a sense in which there's such shallow thinking going on that you just kind of go, well, I'm going to help the marginalized, and all the marginalized must stick together, regardless of whether they actually, care for each other's interests. So if you're gay and you're trans and you're Muslim, I guess we're all part of the same family of friends, right? No, you're not. And so that sort of shallow thinking, will really run you into trouble down the line. That you want to have a set of principles where you think, what are things that I care about? I want to care about freedom. I want to care about respecting other people's rights. That's going to not mean backing the terrorists.
Absolutely. For me, I've always seen the political left, especially what the left has become now, not simply left of center liberal, but I don't have a problem with liberals. We just have slightly different views on how to implement things. But this radical, lunatic leftist nonsense that's pervasive and prevailing all over the world now, I've always seen them as looking at Jews and Muslims and gays as useful idiots, and blacks as useful idiots. And they'll use you as long as you fit their needs, and then they'll toss you aside because they don't really care about you. They care about craving political power. And you're right about these people not knowing what the heck they're protesting. It's absolutely amazing if you have any degree of thought process and you can think critically even remotely. So easy to just destroy the arguments that these people come up with because they make no sense whatsoever. None whatsoever. But I stand, as I've always stood with Israel and with the world's Jews. In this case, they've been demonized and attacked and abused for millennia, and unjustly, in my view. Now, that stands in stark contrast with other folks, but I really don't care. That's my view. That's where I stand. And that doesn't mean I can't criticize Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. Jerusalem I can criticize, and I have. The 1982 invasion of Lebanon, while it was warranted, its execution I thought was questionable. So I'll question Israel when I think it's inappropriate, and that doesn't make me anti-Semitic. It just makes me honest. But anyway, all right. Well, Mark, you've been very generous with your time. I know you've got another meeting to get to, so I want to thank you for going over because we went over a bit here. And I don't want you to make any predictions, but if you want to make a prediction, you can about 29 May. I think that we're going to see a greatly reduced ANC that's desperate for some sort of coalition, and I don't know that the MPC is going to get high enough to be the party in the plurality. But there won't be a majority party come May 30th, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate prediction. I think trying to work out what happens afterwards is very tough. And the sense I get is that people really haven't had that conversation with political parties. That they're going to see where the chips fall. I imagine there's going to be pressure in the ANC to do two different kinds of deals. The one will be, let's get the old gang back together. These are our brothers, who were part of our party before, and I'm sure.
Come on, MK. Come on, EFF. Hey, Cope, you can join us too. Let's get the old gang back together and go on the road.
There will be a faction in the ANC who will be pushing for that, and there will be another faction that sort of, depends how far they slide. I mean, there might be a sense in which they can cobble in some of the smaller parties, maybe try peel off the IFP or, some of the others. But maybe they don't have those numbers. Some of those polls are having them in the high 30s. And then there will be the Government of National Unity talk. So we shall see. We shall see.
Well,
it might take a very long time.
And they only have 14 days under the Constitution to form a government, which is a ridiculously short period of time for a parliamentary system. But in November, after the municipal elections, I predicted, of course, I didn't know about and don't take this as if I think it's a good thing, but the gift of MK, the gift because it's given the ANC fits, that's why I consider it a gift. But I didn't know about the coming MK, which has thrown a monkey wrench into things, especially in KZN. Also, I couldn't predict that the ESCOM would be such an utter failure and have 3 times as many days with no electricity as days with electricity. Those two things coming together. But in November of 2021, I predicted, I'm on record, ANC will not get more than 42% in the 2024 elections, regardless of when they're held, and they could drop as low as 38. And I pray they go to 33. That's what I said. I stick to it, and I might turn out to be pretty close to being on the money the way things are going. We'll see.
Yeah. I always, by the way, when people make election predictions, I always say, put your money where your mouth is. I have a bet with a friend of mine who was convinced that Action SA would get more votes than the EFF. And as much as I don't like Action SA, I thought, well, I think that's a highly unlikely thing. I hope you're right. And I said, let's take a bet on it. And of course, he will be paying me some money.
Well,
It'll
Mark,
be donated to the Free Market Foundation, one of the other good NGOs.
oh, they are good. I've had David Ansar on the program before and some other folks from the Free Market Foundation. Listen, I'm awaiting the passport agency to get off their bum and send me my passport back, which was due for renewal. I'm still waiting with bated breath. If, in fact, it does come through, my plan is to be in Joburg, in Cape Town, and briefly in Port Elizabeth around the election time. If it doesn't get here until after the election, I'll adjust it and see if I can't make a couple of the test matches for the Springboks. But if not, I'll be there probably in June. But my plan is to be there in May. Fingers are crossed. As we say in German, ich drücke die Daumen. So hopefully I'll be there. If so, we'll link up as long as you're free and when I'm in Joburg. And I look forward to it. As always, Mark Oppenheimer, distinct pleasure. Thank you so much. Quel labor. I appreciate your time. Oh, I thought you were going to say something like goodbye or something like that. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wonderful having you on the show. Always love our discussions. And yeah, it'll be fantastic to see you in South Africa.
Excellent. All right, I'll let you drop off. Mark Oppenheimer, folks, thanks for joining us. The co-host of Brain in a Vat and an advocate on the Constitutional Court, and now the president of the Institute of Race Relations South Africa, and also is with UCT now too. Let me put you in the waiting room there. Okay. All right, and that's it, folks. Thanks a lot for tuning in. At the top of the hour, in about 32 minutes, we have another interview. This will be with a young lady who is a member of Action SA. Of course, yesterday we had Athol Trollope on the program, and but we started a little bit late with that interview because of the building collapse that took place in Georgia. We covered that breaking news. So my thanks once again to Mark Oppenheimer, and stick around. We'll see you guys for the next broadcast, which is in 32 minutes. Thanks a lot. It should be a fascinating conversation with this Action SA candidate. Appreciate you being here, guys. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you here next time. Shortly, that is.